and welcome along to the Property Academy podcast by Opus Partners. I'm your host, Stephen Guy.
And I'm Andrew Nicol.
And today on the show, we're talking about, does a 1% drop in interest rates lead to a 10% increase? Yes, Andrew, a 10% increase in house prices. Now, this is something that I've seen promoted by a couple of property investment companies. Now, and of course, some of them are our competitors. One, of course, was Propeller Property. And I saw the posting on Facebook that we could be seeing a 10% lift in property values for every 1% drop in interest rates. And on top of that, I saw Hannah McQueen, the founder of Enable Me, saying something very, very similar. She said it's a pigeon economic law that a 1% drop in interest rates is followed by a 10% lift in house prices.
What's Pigeon Economics? I've never heard of that.
Well, actually, I had to chat GPT. ChatGPT had never heard of pigeon economics either.
So if you don't know if something's true, you just call it Pigeon Economics.
Well, you can call it pigeon anything. But
basically, all of my economic data that I come up with.
But my point here is that I wanted to find out if this was true, because sometimes you see things quoted in the media, or people will say things and say, oh, it's a rule of thumb. And then you go, but is it? And so a 1% drop in interest rates, 10% increase in house prices, it seemed a bit steep to me.
It'd be great if it was that easy, right?
Well, it would absolutely be wonderful, especially since we're predicting about a 1.7% drop in the one-year rate over the next 12-ish months. So I wanted to know, is this true? What's the basis for it? What's the source for it? And so we're going to go through that. I started Googling around, and at first I thought maybe it came from this article by Tony Alexander in One Roof, where he said expect a 10% increase in house prices in 2024 and more in 2025. That was written in 2023. That's definitely in there, but it doesn't mention that relationship between interest rates and house prices. I also took a look at interest.co.nz. Back in 2021, Greg Ninnis, who's their property editor, he was talking about that we could see a 10% drop in house prices for every 1% rise in mortgage interest rates. But that's all I could really find. That's the only source material I could find about that. We actually got our journalists to call up both Hannah McQueen at Enable Me and Nikki Connors from Propeller. We didn't receive a response. So, Andrew, falling interest rates, it should actually have an impact on house prices, but what's the kind of economic rationale between interest rates falling and house prices going up?
Okay, so if your interest rates come down, firstly, it's going to make it easier to borrow money because servicing test rates come down as well. Makes it more affordable for you to go to the bank and get a mortgage. Couple that with the fact that it's cheaper to have that mortgage. So if I know that I can comfortably afford $1,000 a week towards my mortgage payment, if interest rates come down, that $1,000 goes further, right? So it kind of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy because all of a sudden interest rates have come down. I can get more money from the bank. I can afford a higher value property. And so I go out and spend more money on a house.
Yeah, or you might start to bid up the price of properties. Yeah. You're at an auction and you think, oh, well, interest rates are coming down. Yeah, you know what? I can actually afford it, so I'm going to put my hand up and start bidding this house price up. The other kind of self-fulfilling prophecy we see is that people know or believe that as interest rates come down, we're going to see house prices go up. So if you're thinking, okay, interest rates are going to go down over the next year, 2 years, year and a half kind of thing, well, I better buy now because as soon as the interest rates go down, house prices are going to go up. And so people start to pull their property purchases forward. If you're a first home buyer and you were planning to buy a house in maybe a year or 2 years, or you're a property investor and you were planning to buy in a year or 2 years, maybe you do it now because you say, well, in the future, house prices are going to be more expensive, so I better move my purchase forward. That becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy because if everybody does that, we start to see house prices go up.
Yeah, but I don't think, I mean, that whole term pigeon economics, I think is that just bull? Yes, economics, like just completely made it. And don't get me wrong, I've used rule of thumbs in the past, and then Ed just goes and disproves me on these things. So I get why you come up with these things, but there's so much more to it than just interest rates. Like there are things like migration and employment. There's so many more factors than just saying, oh well, if interest rates come down 1%, we see house prices go up 10%. If it was that easy, that would be fantastic, but that's not real.
Well, I think the main thing you've got to think about as well is, well, over what time frame? Because you could say, okay, like for example, we expect that house prices will go up when there is very, very high migration. We saw very, very high migration back in 2023. Lots and lots of people moving to New Zealand, many more than those who were leaving. That should have an impact on house prices. It hasn't been felt by the market yet. perhaps all of those people are still renting. They're not at the stage where they're ready to buy a house. So maybe it will have a flow-on effect, but it hasn't actually happened yet. So there is an argument to say that maybe interest rates come down, but it might take time for that to flow through into the market. Now, my issue with that, interest rates 1% down, house prices 10% up, is it sounds that it's automatic, that it just happens,
Yeah.
that if interest rates fall by 1% over a year, then house prices will go up by 10% in that year. I don't think that's necessarily true.
Which, if you could say 10% over any time frame, 15 years, yeah, no, it happened over 15 years. Yeah, that, of course it will.
And one of the interesting things is I was thinking about, well, interest rates have increased by a lot over the last 2 years. What was the relationship with house prices? So we saw a massive increase in the 1-year rate from under 2.3% in mid 2021 all the way up to over 7.3%. So just rough numbers, the 1-year interest rate rose by 5 percentage points. Pop quiz, Andrew. How far did house prices fall from the peak to the trough according to Rhines?
20%?
Yeah, 18%. Yeah, but pretty close. So we saw interest rates go up by 5%. So by that logic of 1% move in interest rates, 10% change in house prices, well, we should have seen house prices come down 50%. We didn't see that. What did we see? We saw house prices come down by 20%. So it was kind of a 1% change in the interest rate led to about a 3.6% change in house prices in that one example. That's not to say that the relationship is actually a 1% move in interest rates equals a 3 or a 4% change in house prices.
And actually, did you talk to any other economists about this?
Well, I wanted to get a bit of a straw poll.
Oh, yeah? Okay,
You know?
so you're going to use some of your pigeon polling.
I was going to say that too. I did a pigeon poll. So I called up Calvin Davidson. He's the economist over at CoreLogic, great friend of the show. And he agreed that, look, lower mortgage rates, they do drive up house prices, and higher interest rates, they do drive down house prices. But there's no hard and fast rule. You know, you've got to think about immigration, job growth, bank credit policy. Are they lending more money? Are they lending less money? Of course, we've now got the DTIs. And one thing he did notice is that, some people think that mortgage interest rates, they might drop by 2% over the next 2 years. But he says, I don't think that we're going to see a 20% increase in house prices over the next 2 years because we've got things like DTIs
Yeah,
now.
I think that's one of the things that people forget. Like the DTIs, while not having an impact at the moment on people's lending ability, they will in the future as interest rates come down. And that's something that we haven't had before. So we've got no way of gauging how that is going to impact the market compared to the past.
Well, the interesting thing is we've got an absolute incentive to tell everybody that this rule of thumb, this pigeon rule, is true, right? Because we recommend especially new build investment properties to investors. So, of course, we've got an incentive to talk up the market and say, yeah, if interest rates come down by 1%, market up by 10%, you better buy now. And, of course, buy through your old mates at Opus Partners. But I don't think that's the right thing to do, because then if people have the wrong expectations, they buy an investment property, it doesn't go up by 10% in the first year, and then they say, oh, property investment doesn't work. But property investment, of course, is a long-term game. So we've got to have the right expectations. And so as part of my pigeon poll, I also called up Kelly Eckold, who is the chief economist at Westpac. And one of the things he was saying to me is, well, that relationship, 1% drop in interest rates, 10% increase in house prices, you've got to question whether that's temporary or permanent. So a 1% fall in interest rates forever, if the interest rates come down by 1% forever, yes, that is going to have a really large impact, possibly larger than 10%. But if it's only temporary, then you're not going to have that same amount of impact. And so here's a little snippet of what he said.
I think probably what you're really asking about is that if you think about a fall in interest rates in a cyclical sense, where interest rates maybe go down for a while and then ultimately return to some sort of like average or neutral level, then the idea of a 10% total adjustment wouldn't be out of court. But I don't think you would necessarily expect that to happen in a particular year. It could be something, for example, that would transpire over 2 or 3 years.
So, Andrew, what's he really saying there?
So he's saying, yeah, if interest rates come down, you could expect property prices to go up, but not straight away. It could take 2 or 3 years to do that, to achieve that growth. So you do still have to be thinking about property on a longer term horizon.
And the other thing I think he's saying is you've got to think about the starting point of the housing market. If you're in a position where that's kind of, neutral, then you could see it take off faster with that drop of interest rates. But at the moment, the housing market is still pretty tired or flabby or depressed, whatever adjective you want to use. It's not in a great state. So even if you see interest rates come down, you're not automatically going to see the housing market roar back to life. It's going to take some time because right now there are a decent number of listings, so there's quite a bit of supply. Demand is still pretty low. And look, interest rates will have an impact on house prices, but it's not going to be straight away. And I've got a little bit of a clip for you from him here as well.
Essentially, demand has to probably rise quite a bit just to meet current supply.
So, Andrew, what's our take on all of this?
So right now, there is so much stock available that a 1% drop is not going to fix the market automatically. It's probably just going to get to a point where it's a more normal level. So again, it's going to take some time.
It's quite fascinating. As I said, I think ANZ are predicting quite a large drop in the 1-year interest rate. But over the next year, they're actually thinking that capital growth will be quite muted, well under 5%. And so we've just got to be careful when we're using rules of thumb. I always say you've got to make sure that your rule of thumb is not a rule of dumb, which is that, you're using this rule of thumb thinking it's really good, but actually it's just really dumb because it's not even true.
Yeah, so I get what you mean about the starting point before, because, if interest rates were 21% and they came down to 20%, it's still bloody expensive, right?
Oh, yeah, there's definitely that part. But also, if the housing market is really quiet, it's going to take some time for it to roar back to life. It's not going to be a switch where it automatically comes back on. And so just be really careful. Your rules of thumb aren't rules of dumb. What should investors take away from this?
I think the main thing is right now, the property market is pretty tough. And so you're seeing a whole lot of gimmicks and sales tactics used out there. Don't take some pigeon data like this and automatically think you must get in right now or you're going to miss the opportunity.
Now, of course, there are opportunities, but it's about making sure that you're doing it in an informed way rather than,
expecting overnight growth.
Yeah, I think that's probably fair to say. Right, let's wrap it up there. But please don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. It really does help us get the message out to more people. And hey, if you're listening on Apple or Spotify and you want to see some of the graphs we're sharing, just Google Opus Partners YouTube. It'll be the first thing that comes up. If you are watching on YouTube, make sure you hit the subscribe button. We release new videos on here every Monday and Wednesday. Thanks for listening to the Property Academy podcast. I'm your host, Steve McKnight.
And I'm Andrew Nicol.
We're going to be back again tomorrow with even more daily strategies, tactics, and insights to help you get the most out of the New Zealand property market. Until next time.